Today we're going to be making pot holders. So I've cut my decorative fabric. I'm just doing a little Christmas theme here. Into 9x9 squares. And I've also cut a piece of terry cloth. This is just, what you'd find in a towel or a washcloth. That's pretty thin for a towel, but you can buy it by the yard. Usually Hobby Lobby or Joann carries it. And then this is a piece of Insul-Bright. This is really important when you're making a pot holder. If you can see that metallic glint in there, it has a layer of mylar, which helps reflect the heat and help you not burn your hand. The reason you have a layer of terry cloth is just to soak up any condensation. So it's not imperative, but it's nice if you don't want to ruin furniture. So I'm going to start with this. I like to use 505 temporary adhesive. You can also use safety pins. Either way is fine. This is pretty quick. Then you just layer in your terry cloth. Make sure it's smooth. You don't want to have any wrinkles. It's always good to iron first. Then I put my Insul-Bright, also available at Joann or online. Instead of the terry cloth, if you have all natural cotton batting, that works really well too, maybe even slightly better. I just bought some batting, but now I can't find it, so I'm using terry cloth. Also, I like 9x9 because my husband likes it to cover his whole hand, or like to be the same diagonal width as his hand. I don't know, we had a whole conversation about this. But we've noticed that ready-to-wear pot holders are all different sizes, including some are really small. So you do you, boo-boo. All right, now I have a rectangle. If you want a rounded edge, you're gonna take anything from a cup to a bowl. I have some circle templates here, but let's say you just want to use the top to your 505. You can use anything to cut the curves. Now, the downside to the curves is it changes what kind of binding you have to have. With a rectangle, you don't have to have bias binding, but for an oval, I recommend bias binding. If you don't know the difference, this is a piece of bias binding, and hopefully you can see this. Here we go. It stretches just a little bit because it's cut on a 45-degree angle and a piece of fabric. Whereas, oh, that is too. I'm trying to find a piece of binding that's not cut. So this is just cut straight across the top. It has no give to it, or very little. It does not stretch the same way, and so it makes going around curves harder. These curves are pretty slight, so honestly, it might not matter. So I'm holding my circle in the corner, and this is not an exact science, but I'm just curving the edges. Now, if you wanted to not waste these corners of fabric, you could also, cut out a piece of paper with these curves already there. Any unevenness you see, we'll take care of that after we quilt it. Even with a quilting foot, you're gonna get some shifting. So I'm not too concerned because you always clean up your squares afterwards, or your pot holders, whatever you want to call it. I was thinking quilting, but you always clean it up after you quilt it too. All right, now I have a nice oval pot holder. All right, so the next step, all you're gonna do is quilt it however you'd like. If you wanna play with a free motion quilting foot that came with your machine, that's awesome. If you want to play it safe because it's a gift and just do straight lines, I recommend about 1 inch apart. You can go both directions, you can go one direction, you can go diagonally if you're feeling sassy. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to go do that. If you have a walking foot, it does help keep these from shifting a little bit. I mean, you'll still get some squishing and stuff like that, but not nearly as badly. If you don't have a walking foot, it's okay. Just lighten the amount of pressure on the presser foot just a little bit so it doesn't mess up your tension, and it'll still be fine. In fact, I will do this one without a walking foot. I'll be right back. Okay, here are two that I've quilted. This one was quilted with a quilting foot, and this one was quilted without, but remember this was already crooked when I started. But you can see some smooshing out to the sides. All right, so I'm gonna move this one off and come back to our original one. So now all you're gonna wanna do is clean up the edges just so it's nice and tidy. If this makes your curves a little more pointy, just trim them off. Try not to trim your fingers with it because that would definitely ruin the Christmas spirit. In fact, this one you can see the white around the edge here. So I'm gonna come around it like so. All right, looking good. A couple other things I wanted to point out. When you are quilting your potholder, you don't need to back up, like back stitch on each edge. If you're just starting at the beginning and going all the way to the ends of the rows will be covered by the binding. So you don't need to back stitch or anything like that. You can just go straight through. This one is ready to be bound. So I'm going to walk you through cutting bias binding since I did this one on the curves. Again, if you're doing a rectangular one, you can just cut your binding straight across and then follow the video tutorial for the mug rug because it shows you how to miter the corners. This is another one that I have ready to be bound. Let me make sure. Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't going to be too hideous. So here's my fabric. You can see that I already have a 45-degree angle here. Let me zoom out. I already have a 45-degree angle. If I didn't, what you would do is you would take your top square, right here where my hand is, and you would fold it down at a 45-degree angle and cut it on the angle. So you would cut your strip here. I am cutting my binding strips 2 inches wide. If that makes you a little nervous, you can do 2.25. Just depends on what look you like. Since I already have this edge started, wow, what a mess. I'm actually going to continue it and cut another strip. Try not to cover up your knife like I do. Makes everything a little bit more difficult. So I'm cutting on the bias, and again I'm cutting a 2-inch strip. Ooh, don't do what I did. I got a little bit off there, see? Might be time for a new blade. What do you think? All right, then you're gonna take your bias strip here and make the edge straight. And what I like to do, well, first you're gonna iron this like a hot dog. So you're gonna iron it long edges together. So I'm gonna go do that real quick. Okay, I have now ironed it like a hot dog, and you can see that it has a little bit of give to it. Now I'm gonna just make sure that it's long enough. So I'm gonna start at the top corner. That is at an angle. I'm gonna make it straight. I'm gonna start at this top corner, even though it's on a curve, and just walk it around the edge. And this one appears to be perfect. Excellent. All right, if it wasn't long enough, this is what you would do. So this is a pair of bias, a piece of bias binding I cut before. And here is another piece. You're gonna set them at a 90-degree angle, right sides together. And then you're going to sew diagonally from this corner to this corner. When I say corner, it's the corner of the piece on the bottom. But you're gonna sew diagonally, and then you're gonna trim your seam allowance, and if you trim it super close, don't worry about it, but if you trim it 1/4 of an inch, then press it open. That way, when you fold it, everything will line up super nicely, and it'll still be stretchy, okay? It'll also be almost, you won't be able to tell. This piece was sewn together like I just described, and you can tell because it doesn't line up, but once it's on your pot holder, nobody will know. Okie dokie. So moving right along. The way I'm gonna do this is I'm gonna start on this top edge. And then as I'm sewing it around, I'm just going to ease the binding around the curves. In fact, I'm not gonna pin it all the way around first. So I'm gonna ease it so there's no wrinkles in it and sew it on with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'm gonna sew it to the front of my pot holder because I like to hand sew on the back. I think it looks nicer in the end, and it only takes about 15 minutes. So I'm gonna go ahead and go do that, and I will be right back. Once you get to the top, make sure you press this nicely. Once you get to the top, you wanna stop before you get to your original stitches. All right, you don't wanna sew over this because remember, you still have to fold it to the back, okay? Let's go. We are now ready to sew our binding, our bias binding onto our pot holder. Again, if you did the straight corners, you're gonna wanna skip over to the mug rug tutorial so you can see how to miter those corners. I'm gonna switch out this foot to a 1/4 inch piecing foot. This is not imperative, but I happen to have one, so I might as well use it. You know what also helps is if you actually thread the needle. Okay. So again, you're going to want to ease it around the corner, close to the edge, without getting wrinkles in it. And I am going to backstitch at the beginning. So I'm back up to the top, and I'm going to stop before I get to where I started my binding. Okay, my binding is on. I'm gonna make sure I didn't get any wrinkles in the corners, so that's good. So now I'm ready to fold it to the back and hand stitch it in place. Meet me back over at the table for a date. Okay, I've got my thread that matches my binding and a hand sewing needle. And I'm just gonna cut off a random length piece of this, long but not too unwieldy. Then I'll thread my needle, maybe. And I'm gonna knot one end a few times so it doesn't pull through. So starting at the top, I'm gonna get my tail of binding out of the way. All you're gonna do is fold it to the back. Look at how nice that curve is. So I'm actually gonna flip this over to the back, get all my excess binding out of the way. And as I fold it over, I'm gonna clip it in place. I prefer clips because they're easier to take off as I go than a pin. They don't move things. But again, if you don't have clips, never fear. Just use what you have. Binder clips are fine. Or pins, whatever floats your boat. The important thing is to not stress, just find joy. I'm finding joy in the fact that my binding is so funky looking. That is bringing a smile to my face. So I'm going to trim any threads that I come across just so they don't get caught. Don't you love this Santa, this bucking bronco, but he's on a reindeer. It's on Rudolph. It just cracks me up. Don't ask me where I got it because I've had it for several years, and I decided a pot holder was the perfect choice of what to use it for. I also put it on one of our Christmas countdown calendars that you can get free on the blog. But I would like to use it on things that are gonna last for a long time because it makes me laugh. So as you're doing this, make sure you don't accidentally, I see a thread, sorry. You wanna make sure that you get all of the layers wrapped and that you don't accidentally, I'll show you right here, push this up the wrong way and like get it caught in there all funky. So just tuck as you go and clip. I think this is the perfect size for me for the binding. If you are a beginner and you want something a little bit longer, an extra 1/4 of an inch tall will only end up in an extra 1/8 of an inch once it's folded over. And sometimes that's just enough to make your life a little easier. Okay, as you get to the end here, you will notice that it is loose and I did not sew it. You have two choices. You can either sew this on by hand, tie off, and come back and sew this with your sewing machine, or you can just sew it by hand and then come back and do the whole thing. I want a loop at the end. You have two options. You can either, hold on just a second. So for my loop, I want it to be about that long. You like how scientific this is? It's about 3 inches. I have no idea how long it is. Cutting it a little bit longer is always nicer than cutting it a little shorter. You know what I mean? As you're going around sewing by hand, what you can do is fold this over. I'm actually going to move this clip so you can see what I'm doing. But essentially what you're going to want to do is fold the raw edge in toward the middle and overlap it with the folded edge. So you're creating sort of, you know, double fold binding, but not quite. Does that make sense? You just want to make sure that raw edge is enclosed. So I'll show you again. From the front, it's sewn to the edge, and you're gonna hand sew it, overlap it, the raw edge from where you started, and then keep going. But you know what? I'm just gonna show you as I go. How about that? Let's get this party started. Okay, so now I'm gonna start hand sewing because explaining that while not doing it was just too much for my pea-sized intellect. I've got threads hanging from me. I'm gonna get my tail out of the way, and I'm gonna hide my knot underneath against the potholder and come out right on the fold. And then essentially what you're gonna do is just a little ladder stitch going about every 1/4 of an inch to 3/8. The smaller you go, the tighter it will be, the more tedious it will be, but the less likely it'll be to come off. So you just kind of find a groove. But basically you go into the fold. Wow, there we go. You go into the fold, and then inside the fold you go down about a 1/4 of an inch and come back out. And then, once you're out and you've pulled your thread and it's not caught on a clip, you're gonna go straight across into the potholder and go underneath the first layer, not the whole thing, just the first layer of fabric, about a 1/4 of an inch and pop out. And you will do that all the way around. I highly suggest listening to a book while you do this. As you go, you want to make sure that you keep your binding tight around the edge. That will just help it look nicer when you're done. As you're doing the curves, just make sure you're keeping everything flat, and it should come together with no problem. So right here is a perfect example. I'm all the way down here, and I can see that I took way too big a jump right here. I'm not sure what I was thinking. So what you would do is you would turn it around. These clips are driving me a little batty right now because I keep getting caught on them. So you would turn it around and just go back. You would backtrack where you are. You're still going to backtrack with your stitches, so I'm going straight across, and I'm going to come up in between my other 2 stitches that are already there. Oh my goodness. This is a reason not to use clips. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to come out in between those 2 clips because somehow I just left way too big a gap. But once you get this whole thing sewn on, no one will even know that you had to backspace there. Whereas if I were doing it with a machine and I got off the binding on the back from the machine or just left it too floppy, if you've ever tried it with a machine, you know how possible that is. All right, so now you can see actually my black thread there, which won't be noticeable once I'm completely done. So I've closed that up, and I'm just gonna go back the original direction again. And I can actually go a little bit bigger now that I've closed up that spot. Okay, I am now back to the beginning. So not terrible, definitely a little labor of love, but remember, it's fun. And if you're like me, you can enjoy it all year round. So as I get back to the beginning here, this is the front. I probably went a little too close because, yeah. So what you're gonna wanna do is make sure you keep the raw edge against the edge of your pot holder, like that. I don't really need to clip it though. I'm gonna flip it over to the back. So you can see the raw edge is on the inside here, toward the middle. I'm going to overlap where we started. And that I am gonna clip, because you definitely wanna hide all of your raw edges. So you wanna make sure the raw edge stays folded toward the middle. If you have a piece of wash away wonder tape, that will work really well. I don't know where I put mine, so I'm not gonna use it. But you're gonna clip it, and then keep that raw edge folded toward the inside and hidden. So all the way back. Open it up just to where it's like folded once. Tuck in the raw edge, and then I refold the long raw edge so it's against the middle. And then my end is completely closed in. So I'm going to clip that. That means that down here, I don't have to worry about tucking it in or anything, and it's easier to keep this tight. So now you have another choice. You can take this over to the sewing machine and sew the rest of this with your sewing machine, or you can continue on by hand. We have clipped our end, so it is no longer raw. We've almost made it back to the beginning. I'm going to be honest. I don't want to hand sew this. Okay, we are ready to finish this. I'm gonna start a little bit before, probably in this black area, just to make sure I get everything. I'm going with a normal straight stitch. And I am gonna back stitch at the beginning. I think the most important thing here is to make sure that this is tight against the edge, so you really make sure you get it covered up. Right about now I'm wishing I had found my wash away wonder tape, but we'll see how this goes. So I'm going to follow it straight. And then I'm going to let my loops portion here veer off. I'm trying to get close to the edge. I'm going to back stitch at the end. It is now time to sew our loop to the back of our pot holder. I am actually going to sew it into the pot holder fabric itself because it's thinner than trying to go through the binding. So all I've done is I've made a cutie little loop, and I'm going to sew a zigzag stitch as well as back stitch at the beginning. I've got some threads to trim and we are good to go. Right? Who thinks we're good to go? I think we're good to go. I don't know what, oh, it just got. All right, so there you go. Remember, you can just tack it on there with the little zigzag back stitch at the front and back. That way you don't have to worry about it coming undone. But then you're done. All right, I hope you enjoyed this. Make sure you share all your pretty pot holders.